Welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. We're recording this episode on Thursday, July 13th, and joining me as always, my partner, my friend, an occasional combatant, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, I think we might have a disagreement on our hands here. You and I have had this conversation about whether or not leadership matters. In fact,
I mean, it matters for a company, but does it matter for the economy? Does it matter, whether a president of a country on his own, especially in the U.S., right, where we have a strong system of checks and balances? Does it matter whether it's a Democrat in the White House or Republican in the White House? Yes or no?
Set the party issue aside. I mean, and let's just look at through the lens of the original premise there, which is, does leadership matter? And when we were talking offline, you had cited a paper that you had read that was called Leadership or Luck. And I have to read this. I have not read it. I have to read it. I mean, I would be of the opinion that the people who have some level of control over policy, especially someone who would be in the highest office in the land, would have significant accountability to what happens inside of the economy. And if it's not actually literally pulling levers, would be influencing those who pull levers. And so that's where we're going to start.
Spot on. When you think about the policies, I think very often people will overemphasize or exaggerate the immediate impact of many policies, right? Because they don't actually understand how the policy works. I've seen this even with professional economists, where they don't take into account, they might look at one, like a static effect, like the effect of the policy on one group of people or on one, and they don't take into account the fact that prices change, the price-induced changes will also affect how other people respond to the policy change. And very often, when you take into account the dynamic effects of a policy, whether it's over time, especially over time, what you end up learning is the impact of the policy is usually much smaller in magnitude than what people had said previously.
I appreciate that. And you and I always keep it civil, and this is going to remain civil.
I cannot talk about one administration or another, but I can talk about 50 years of economic data and changes in the White House. And I can tell you something. If you believe that leaders matter, then the U.S. economy has grown faster and scored higher on many other macroeconomic metrics when the president of the United States was a Democrat than a Republican. Real GDP growth, lower unemployment rate, and the list goes on and on. And so the question is, were these Democrat leaders lucky? Did they come into the White House inheriting really good initial conditions to start with? Or did they actually have a hand in boosting consumer confidence, boosting investment, and getting the U.S. economy to outperform during their tenure, right? And so that's the question. So you have the consumer sentiment, and then there's the question of, well, what kind of policies did they enact and what impact did it have on the economy, right? And so it's a very tough question. It's a very tough question to address. I think a lot of the literature on this topic is kind of at odds with each other. You have one side that says leaders matter, right? In the White House, presidents matter. Especially in non-democracies, some of the literature says, where you have a dictator, they can just go and do their thing. But in democracies, with a system of checks and balances, it's much more difficult to tease out whether or not the White House actually had an impact during that 4-year presidential term.
I think it's fair to say this, and I think for the people that are out there that have never had like a top leadership responsibility inside of small business or even inside of like a community organization, like if you've never run your own like local little league, and had to be responsible for the financial well-being of even something that maybe was running on, say, like a $5,000 annual budget. Maybe it looks easy, and maybe it would appear that whoever steps into whatever situation, that there was nothing that preceded it. And so when I explain to people like how it really works in leadership, you and go into an environment and think about it on the number line. I think most people view the new start of a presidency or the new start of a governor's tenure or a mayor's tenure as starting at zero on the number line, as if nothing has preceded it. That is false. Some environments are better than others, but the vast majority of the time, unless someone's term limited out like they are in politics, most people who would come in and from the outside and take over an organization are taking over an organization that has in some way, shape, or form failed or underperformed expectations, or literally is in a state of potentially financial extremis, certainly not at zero on the number.
Exactly. Inherited conditions play a huge role.
My criticism of what we're dealing with now in this economy comes back to, I think, one significant decision, if not two significant decisions. And I know you can't talk about it. I'm not going to ask you to talk about it, but I can talk about it. These are the kinds of decisions. So like when we talk about like, do leaders matter and does policy matter?
Policy matters for sure. It's just that I think a lot of times we exaggerate the impact, but it's also just not in the United States, we have the system in place where, you cannot attribute the policy to one person. You just can't. You have Congress. Their job is to legislate, right? And so attributing economic success for a period of time to a president, I think is foolish at best. And whether it's positive or negative. So, and then of course, you have this back and forth where, and I've said this before, where, you have one party comes in, they set an agenda, and then another party comes in and it raises that agenda. And that has implications for the long run, because ultimately we need to set an agenda that is good for Americans, for consumers, for households, and we need to stick to it and see it through. If we continue to go back and forth, we make no progress while the rest of the world continues to advance. We're everyday economics. We're going to stick to the economics. And the economics say that, verdict is still out on this one, man. You got a lot of literature that says that leadership, the president, does matter. And then you have a lot of literature that says that the president actually doesn't really matter. Some literature say coaches in sports matter. And some literature say coaches don't matter. And some say chief executive officers definitely matter. We've seen big turnarounds. And others say, well, actually, when you really consider this question carefully and you do the work on this and you try to get to a causal impact of the CEO on the business, well, sometimes it's not really there. And so, literature's still out on this one. I think it's a great topic for research. And I hope to see more work on this.
I appreciate the fact that you and I live in a place where we can have this conversation.
That's right.
And this conversation, my friend, is far from over. But this episode is over. And thank you, Dr. O. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.